them in. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that St. Mark's Cathedral gathers on the land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people who are still here. And we honor with gratitude the land itself and the life of the Duwamish tribe. So I would like to open us in prayer. And we begin with our prayer with a passage from Jeremiah. Thus says the Lord, stand at the crossroads and look, and ask for the ancient paths, where the good way lies, and walk in it, and find rest for your souls. Holy God, quiet our minds and open our hearts to your wisdom and love, passed from you to generation. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, I am delighted that so many people have joined, and we have even more coming in the next couple of minutes. Greetings to all of you who are part of the St. Mark's community and those who are farther flung. I bring you greetings from the people of St. Mark's and also from our Dean, Steve Thomason, who is traveling on East Coast time and so isn't able to join us tonight, but he does send you his greetings and blessings. And especially a warm welcome to our leader tonight, the Reverend Dr. Hilary Raining, who is St. Mark's Theologian in Residence for 2022. And Dr. Raining wears many hats and has many gifts. She's the rector of St. Christopher's Episcopal Church in Gladwin, Pennsylvania, a founding director of the DMin program at General Seminary in New York, the creator of The Hive, wonderfully imaginative and prayerful and spiritual community on the web. She may talk about that as well. But we are so delighted that she is our theologian in residence and that she will join us this week and next, talking about blood memory and spiritual inheritance. So welcome, Dr. Raining.
Thank you. And thank you so much for that warm welcome and for all of you for being here tonight. And especially to the Cathedral for inviting me to be the theologian in residence this year. I am delighted and excited to see where we will go in this journey together. So again, thank you, thank you. I'm going to be talking a lot tonight, but I don't want to be the only one talking. I highly encourage and invite you, if at any point you have a thought or a question that you want to respond to in some of the conversations, that you go ahead and either lift your hand, or even better, use the little emoji hand lift in your chat feature there. That way it'll pop you to the top of this dual screen, and I'll be able to pause and hear the wisdom you want to share. The other thing I want to mention tonight is we will be talking a lot about issues with trauma. Of probably many different varieties. So I want to give you that warning right at the very beginning, and to encourage you to take care of yourself in any possible way. If you feel any sort of response or PTSD response to any of the conversations we have tonight, know that you are more than welcome to gracefully bow out if that is what will keep you safe, and that is completely understood and encouraged. So take care of yourselves out there. We're all in the midst of a traumatic moment, are we not? So our topic tonight is blood memory and generational trauma. I'm going to be looking at it through the lens of both neuroscience and what happens to us as people when we are in a midst of trauma, but also what happens to our cultures and our communities when trauma has hit us as a group. I'll be looking at that in particularly through the lens of, as I said, neurological research, but also indigenous spirituality and wisdom. I myself am a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, where my grandfather was born on the reservation. And our family is kind of an example of what can happen when a family is both kept from their lineage and then reintroduced through it, through trying to heal the soul wound. And I'll explain more about that as we go. But I also am very aware of my Irish background as well, and the indigenous wisdom that comes through the Celts. So you'll probably hear a little bit of Celtic wisdom tonight thrown in to boot. So for any Celtic lovers out there, we got some for you too. So, to begin with, wanted to highlight for you all just a reminder of where we are too in this time. We are in a moment of global trauma. I'm sure I don't need to remind you of that, but it's worth naming because what we're doing here tonight, both personally and as a culture, is to see how we might be able to send healing back through our own lineage as well as into our culture. The indigenous wisdom that we know comes to us through this understanding of blood memory. I first came to this when I was on a research pilgrimage to my reservation, and our indigenous healer talked about the importance of blood memory. It's a concept that science is only just now catching up to, but it essentially is a honoring of the fact that your ancestors are with you at all times, that you carry within you those who have gone before and those who you will be bringing into the world. In our indigenous brothers and sisters mindset, that goes on for 7 generations before you and beyond you. Science hasn't quite caught up to being able to study 7 generations yet, but what they are finding is that for at least 3 generations, people who have experienced trauma will actually, in turn, pass on the effects of that trauma to their offspring. And I don't just mean that in the fact that you might imagine somebody being raised in a traumatic environment might pass on that by parenting. Actually, what they're finding is that the science says that even the DNA of offspring from somebody who's had a traumatic experience can in turn be changed. So, for example, if your grandmother, let's say your maternal grandmother, suffered a traumatic event, what would end up happening to her is she would go through all of the things that happens to a human being when they experience a traumatic event, and we'll talk about that tonight. But then she will have her DNA altered in such a way that then her offspring and then her offspring's offspring will be more prone to things like depression, will have higher suicide rates, will be more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, having some sort of numbing approach to dealing with their traumatic stress. And it actually will even change the way the cells will transmit hormones in the body. So it will affect things like the types of hormones that encourage human connection, thus making future generations less able to make bonds with one another. You can see how this could be a really perpetuating sort of cycle. And as I said, our indigenous brothers and sisters had a name for it. They call that blood memory and the soul wound. Blood memory and the soul wound. In particular, communities who have suffered a communal soul wound watch what ends up happening to not just the individuals in the community, but the community as a whole. For example, there's been many studies done on Rwanda genocide victims and watching their particular lineage go down and the birth rates being so much lower for those who had suffered trauma, and the PTSD responses being so much more passed down. Indigenous cultures here in North America, they've been able to do cross-generational studies of watching the effects of a cultural genocide happening within our own country. And my own family, as I said, as an example of this, so much for our family was lost in even just the 3 generations since my grandfather. As I said, he was born on the reservation, but he was not raised on the reservation. And in fact, many of what he was told to do was to keep quiet about his heritage and not to let anybody know if he was Native American because he could pass as white. And so what ended up happening was that his mother, my great-grandmother, told him not to encourage learning about his rituals, not to advertise that, to say that he was of a different background ethnically if anybody asked him about his heritage. Likely because she was concerned that he would be taken to one of the boarding schools that was so prevalent in that time frame. So what ends up happening then is a cultural depravity for our family. We weren't able to learn all of that. And then within just 1 generation, so much of that is stripped away. And now our family is doing our best to relearn these things, to go to our reservation, to talk to our elders, to learn about the cultural heritage that is so important to figuring out who you are in relationship to God. And we'll talk more about why that is as we go through all of this. I'm going to turn now to how trauma affects the body to explore how this soul wounds happens. But I wonder if anybody has a comment or question, even at that introduction. As I said, I don't want it to just be me tonight. And if you do have your hand, just go ahead and open your mic because it's hard to tell with so many screens. Okay, quiet group, but we'll keep going. We'll come back. I'm sure you'll have some more thoughts as we go. So the human brain is an amazing construct. It wants to do its darndest to keep you safe, to keep you whole, and it's been doing that since the beginning of the human brain. Evolutionarily speaking, it has a lot of safeguards in it to try to keep you as safe as possible. In fact, neuroscience will often talk about the brain in a simplified way as almost having three different parts. The reptilian brain, which is the oldest part, the mammalian brain, which is the second oldest part, and then the neurocortex, the frontal lobes, as you will, and that's the youngest part of the brain. Trauma triggers have kind of a bottom-up sort of thing that happens to them. When you have a traumatic event happen to you, the first thing that happens is that all of the energies go from the neurocortex or the mammalian brain straight into the reptilian brain, the back of the brain, the brainstem, to get you into survival mode. This puts you into fight, flight, or freeze, and possibly fawn. We'll talk about that one in a moment. Why? Well, let's say a bear is coming at you. It doesn't behoove you to use the part of your brain that's like, I wonder what this bear is like. I should get to know this bear a little bit, before I make any snap judgments. No, evolutionarily speaking, that's not helpful. You don't have time to make snap judgments. So it will instantly tell yourself, your brain will tell itself a story that danger, bring all the resources to make the body ready to go, either to fight or to freeze or to fly, right? The other thing that interestingly happens is this means our brain is necessarily hardwired towards negativity versus positivity. This is an important concept that we'll be coming back to a lot tonight, so I'm going to take a moment to explain it. Neuroscience often talks about the brain as being Teflon for joy and Velcro for negativity. Bummer, right? But again, you can understand why that's helpful from a evolutionarily minded brain. It's better for you to learn a negative lesson faster if it's going to keep you safe, right? It's better if you learn fast if something is poisonous or hot to the touch, or again, that bear coming at you. So the brain preferences these things. At the same time, it does a very fast job of trying to fill in stories for you because the brain loves patterns, and patterns lead to stories. Again, we're going to come back to this concept later, so think about the story piece. What your brain is absolutely unsatisfied with an incomplete pattern because it doesn't know what to do with that information. So without you even knowing it, you will often fill in patterns as a way to keep you safe, so you think. But what ends up happening to the human brain is we start filling in these patterns in negative ways that end up having huge cultural problems, right? Like, so if you've been taught that somebody with a particular skin tone, let's say, is a threat, then every time you are in fight, flight, or freeze mode, your brain is going to fill in that story for you, and then racism is born, right? This is how basic this is even in our brain. So while your brain is going through all this negative stuff and trying to keep you safe, the part of your brain that's going offline, as it were, because the resources are being taken from it, are those more higher functioning thought processes, the mindfulness part of the brain, the logical thought part of the brain, and even in the middle, the mammalian brain, the emotions and memories. So you're not able to call on the parts of yourself that can rationally think yourself through a process. And what ends up happening then, as we're in that automatic trauma response, we end up getting ready to fight, flight, or freeze. And then our bodies have a physical response to this. Hormones like cortisol, the stress hormones, are released, adrenaline, epinephrine, the stuff that makes you get ready. And while that is happening, you have to make decisions in real time. Not a bad thing if a bear is coming at you, right? We can all agree on that. It is a bad thing, though, when you have a traumatic event and then you are re-traumatized again, because the brain sadly doesn't know the difference between pain that's happening to the body or pain that's happening in real time. It thinks it's all the same. So you can break your arm or break your heart, and the brain thinks it's the same sort of pain. And then you can relive a traumatic event, something that happens very often for people who are suffering through PTSD, and your brain doesn't know that it's not happening in real time, especially because the rational part of our brain is turned off. You see how fast this happens and how the cycle can keep going? Because when you're traumatized, you feel like it's happening again and again and again very often. When all this is happening, when you're living in these states of sustained stress, your body begins to live that way, and your body cannot handle that much stress hormone in your body all the time. It's not built for that. The idea is that once that bear goes away, you're supposed to calm down again. But we're living in a moment where not only are we legitimately worried about things like health, safety, whether or not we'll have food on the table. All right, we're living in this time of tremendous stress. Then you layer on top of it war. You layer on top of it racial injustice. You layer on top of it pandemic. Just keep going with all the layers. And then another layer on top of that is the role that advertising and media plays in all of this, just to keep pushing the button of panic. Because if they can get you in a panic state, they can sell you something that will help you feel less panicked, or ideally, right? So there's a cost benefit for somebody having you stay in a traumatic state. We'll pause there before we talk about how this deals with society and the blood memory itself. Any thoughts about that? Anybody felt like you've been in a constant stressful state? Yes, Anne, please. You want to add anything to it, or you were just feeling? Anne, you're muted, so we can't hear you, my friend.
Right. I'm just thinking of something that I'm dealing with because I work in the field of hospice. And what we're focusing on now, which is a new thing in the field, is trauma-informed care. Yeah. That we need to know the past trauma of one of our patients so that we don't inadvertently trigger it, like put a catheter in a rape victim and something like that. And so this is it's so timely. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad. And it's the trauma-informed care is becoming critical because we're all living in such a traumatic time frame. And as we also know, as we've been saying, we're also carrying around with us generational trauma, all coming to a head at the same time. So it's not even just our trauma that we're carrying, it's the trauma of our ancestors as well. So thank you for including that. Others? Yes, Kathy, I see your hand. Go for it, my friend. I think you might be muted.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi there, Hillary. I greatly appreciate your addressing this topic. It's really, really, really important and really pertinent. I feel to all of us, I know I personally have lived in extended states, long lasting stress. And it's very difficult. It just disrupts sleep. It affects mood. It affects perception of what's going on around you. And uh, I can, it's just very difficult. I can say that spiritual practice really it seems to be the way to cut it, to cut through it. And I feel like perhaps I'm doing better with it than I have in the past, simply because during this time of pandemic, it more than being an irritation, and sometimes more than others, but a pretty, this ongoing irritation. I don't feel stressed by it as I have by other conditions in my life in the past. So, but I appreciate your referring to all the different layers, and the media especially. I'm very conscious of how the media, they do just seem to want to amplify the negativity. It's reporting of alarming news. We don't get very often the report of positive things happening in the world, even though they are.
That's actually a perfect segue. So thank you for sharing that, because it's like it's actually exactly where I was hoping we would go. I didn't give Kathy $5 beforehand to say that, so so appreciate you saying that. Yes, and Debbie, my mom, is here tonight. Thank you, Debbie Dowling. And my mother-in-law. Thank you, Connie. So spiritual practices of meditation and nature is essential for calmness. So true, so true. And if anybody else has spiritual practices that help them with their trauma and you want to put it in the chat, please do. Let's share tonight. Kathy was referring to this too. There's good news in this. I know we're starting with the whoa, here's the stuff. But there's very good news in this, and it has to do with, again, the wisdom of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, that it's not trauma is not the final word either for our life, for our the generations beyond us, or even our ancestors. Because what we know from blood memory, both scientifically but even more so spiritually, that when we heal ourselves, when we make the hard choice of saying, okay, this trauma is going to we're putting a line in it here. We're going to do the hard work of trying to let God transform it in our lives here. Then you are doing the tremendously hard thing of creating the posture of least resistance, so the Holy Spirit can do that healing. B, you're also then going to be healing the generations that come after you. Everything we've just said about trauma being passed down, you're trying to end it. But C, because we believe in the communion of saints, we believe we're sending the healing back up through our ancestors as well. If they do indeed live within us, as our Indigenous brothers and sisters believe, then healing ourselves is healing our ancestors too, which I find to be an incredibly holy and beautiful thought. So here's how this works. So when all of this is busy changing our cells and changing the way we can respond to all of this, and then changing how we pass all this down, it's not the only thing that changes us physically or spiritually. We also know through science that a lot can be changed with spiritual practices, and some of the if trauma is to the soul almost like a vice, let's say, the way it works on our soul, not that it's sin, but it works in a negative fashion, then the virtues are the things that can bring in some grace, bring in some posture of healing. A virtue in particular, like gratitude, which is something that science tells us likewise has a pretty dramatic effect on the body. Thankfully, a good one. Hooray, some good news, right? The effect that gratitude has on the body actually is almost counter to the effect that trauma has on the body. Trauma does all the cellular stuff we mentioned. puts in all that stress hormones of all different varieties, as we mentioned. It also starts to work negatively on the brain. It starts to work negatively on the organs. When you're living in that much stress, your organs will even start to shut down. You won't be able to sleep. Your relationships will not work as well because you don't have the same sort of human interaction hormones surging. All this is going on. When you practice gratitude, the opposite happens. It's incredible. People who are practicing gratitude on a regular basis, and it is indeed a practice, given what we've just said about the way the brain holds on to negativity, people who practice gratitude see some remarkable events, I think, happen in their body. They sleep more and better. They get sick less often. For those of us living in COVID, that's pretty good. They have a better immune system. They have better heart health and liver health. They tend to exercise more as well. I think that's related to the fact that they have less depression, so they're able to kind of get up and go more. They're less bothered by physical ailments in the body. They have less inflammation in the body. They report rates of being much happier and optimistic, more joyful. They report having more pleasure in their life. And good news, they recover from stress faster. They are also less lonely. You might think, maybe they're just optimistic, outgoing people. No, actually not. They just have their hormones more regulated. In fact, they have the ability to be in connection because things are working differently. They're working for you, not against you, right? What else is very fascinating about people who practice gratitude, they're helping to build different neurological pathways in the brain. What ends up happening with the brain when you're in a trauma stress is that for the first 90 seconds, you have to stay in that, about 90 seconds. You have to stay in that response, which can feel like an eternity. I know you're like, it's under 2 minutes. No, 90 seconds feels like you're in an eternity when you're in that fight, flight, freeze mode. But what's happening in your brain is it's surging all those hormones, as we said. It's taking all the energy back down to the lizard brain. But after those 90 seconds, here's the thing. You actually can put back on, if you do a certain sort of mindful technique, you can turn back on your frontal cortex. This takes work. This takes a lot of effort to not continue down the actual pathway that you've been going down, because your brain wants you to keep going down that pathway, that neurological pathway. The way the neurological pathways are designed in the brain, it's like a well-traveled road. The more you travel over it, the deeper the grooves in the road get. And your brain likes it if you keep traveling down the fight, flight, or freeze mode, because it will keep you safer if you have to keep running away from that bear. We don't want to keep doing that most of the time, though. We want to be able to turn on our neurocortex. And you have to do that by stopping, maybe even recognizing mindfully that you're in a traumatic moment, and you sometimes even just breathing for 90 seconds can then help you start to go down a different path. And when you start doing that repetitively, you are suddenly building a different road in your brain, one that I think travels right down into the soul, one that becomes more well-traveled. And gratitude is an excellent way of doing that. But as one of our comments here in the chat says, the negative effects are passed down through generations, but not gratitude and other positive pathways with a question mark. Is that the Teflon Velcro thing? Great question. Great question. What we find is that it's not, if you can heal the body from the stress, then gratitude likewise can be passed down, right? The effects of gratitude, just like the effects of trauma, are having an effect on the body. So you can pass this down too. This is the fascinating thing to me, that the stuff of our spiritual ancestors that lives within us surely isn't just the trauma, but also the spiritual practices of things like gratitude and joy that they've passed on to you as well. They're a lot harder to study in the science, so we don't have as much data on this yet. It's a lot easier to study people who've had trauma, because you can say the trauma happened here, this is how they are now. Harder to say, oh, the joy happened here, let's follow them. There's less money to research joy, sadly. But What is fascinating is if you have in your ancestral background um, rituals of gratitude, rituals of joy, you will be more likely to do these things because they're living within you. Okay, I see some hands. Sherry, please go for it. Is it Sherry Bradshaw?
Yes, that's
Great.
right. I'm thinking of this something that's been around a long time, and it's actually a form of practice. I'm not sure it's always helpful though, and I don't want to confuse it with what you're talking about, gratitude, and that's the power of positive thinking, because sometimes that can be helpful, but sometimes it cannot be. It is not
Sometimes
helpful.
it can be toxic, can it
It
not?
can be toxic, exactly. So could you speak to that a little
Love your question.
for a
Thank you.
minute?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So notice how much work this is. This is not the positive, this is not just like go out there and everything, just think positive thoughts all the time. Actually, this is the opposite. It's saying give space to the truth about what you're thinking and feeling. Have those 90 seconds and don't try to just whitewash it away. Because if you do that, you're actually denying it and you'll keep the trauma cycle more ingrained because you'll just keep numbing it away. That's the toxicity around the positive thinking, right? And for us Christians, there's a problem with it too. It streams very much right out of this very American Christianized view of what's known as the prosperity gospel, right? Many of you are probably very familiar with this, but once you see it, you can't unsee it in American Christianity. The prosperity gospel is this, I'll name it as toxic view of the gospel that says if you just do the right stuff in life, if you're the right sort of person, if you said the right sort of prayers, if you haven't sinned, and if you've given enough money to the church normally, there's always that, right? Then God is going to bless you with more riches, more abundance, more prosperity than you could ever hope for. Of course, the problem there being twofold at least, if not 100-fold. One, it puts the onus on works righteousness, right? Like you have to be and do a certain thing to get this goodness. And then of course, when it doesn't happen and when bad things happen, you think you've been a terrible person. So it keeps the shame trauma wheel going like this. On top of all of that, it treats God as kind of like a vending machine. If you put enough good stuff things in, eventually God's going to give you something back. And of course, Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me, not, pick up your slot machine and follow me. It's not the same sort of thing. So you're absolutely right. The problem with that kind of toxic positivity is it not only doesn't honor what's going on in the actual brain science or the soul science, it actually then corrupts us theologically as well. So yes, practice gratitude, but let's talk about how hard that is as a mindfulness practice. It's not just like be positive. When you're practicing something like gratitude and you're working against that fight, flight, or freeze thing, already that's hard. But second of all, as that Teflon thing we were saying is, if your brain wants you to think about the negative stuff more, then you have to work that much harder to really, stop and smell the roses. You have to really work at seeing the joy in life. One of my favorite collects from the prayer book is the one that says, keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night. And then, of course, there's that beautiful line, that almost mysterious line, shield the joyous, right? I think there's something so true about that it's saying joy needs to be shielded and cultivated. It needs to actually have some protection to it. And really, a mindfulness practice, or one that delves back into the rituals of our ancestors, really does that. It says every day I'm going to practice this. Every moment that I'm in a traumatic response, I'm going to try to add a counter narrative. And that's so hard for those of us who live in trauma or PTSD. It's so hard to be able to do that. So I'm not suggesting this is something you're going to do overnight. I'm saying this is a lifetime of learning how to retrain the brain and the soul, so that by little by little we're walking a different path. It's what reconciliation is it not? Turning and walking back to God and back to ourselves. The other thing about trauma, though, that I don't want to paint too rosy a picture of is we don't say in trauma informed pastoral care, we don't say, oh, you're going to be healed of your trauma. You might be able to heal a traumatic bone, but even then, bones, skin, tissue, it's always scarred, right? It's never quite the same. The same is true of Jesus, right? After the traumatic event of going through the crucifixion and resurrection, Jesus still has his scars that you can see. And so we say instead we incorporate our trauma. We let our trauma be transformed and healed so that we can then preach this good news from our scars and not our wounds, right? So Jennifer, I see your hand.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about what you mean when you say mindfulness or practicing gratitude? What does that look like? And maybe this is where you're headed, but
Perfect.
what does it look like throughout the day practically?
Yes, yeah. I'll give you a personal example, and it's one I've shared many times when I'm talking about gratitude, just to say how actually I put my money where my mouth is and how powerful I can tell you it is. Gratitude literally saved my life when I was a teenager. There was a time in my life when it was not going well. I was very close to suicide and thinking that this was going to be the end. And there was a period when God said to me, somehow, write down one thing that you can be grateful for today, just one thing, and that will be a day worth living. And the first day, the only thing I think I could find that day was the song of the birds outside of my window. I can remember it very clearly because it made that much of an impression on my soul. And then the next day it was two things. I think it was like the birds again, same birds were back. And then I think we had like French bread pizza at school. It was nothing major. Do you know what I mean? Like, in fact, the smaller the thing, maybe the better. But it was just enough to say, okay, this is turning me little by little. And then by the end of a month, I had, 30 things on that list and then kept going, right? And it literally saved my life because it helped to change the way I was seeing the world. So, for those who want to start practicing gratitude, it can be as simple as writing one thing down a day. Nothing major. It doesn't even have to be that much. We can go even further and start to talk about the ways that we can do this in community as well. Mindful practices in community. Now, obviously, there are things like ritual and prayer. In our own tradition in the Episcopal Church in particular, the Eucharist itself is thanksgiving. It is itself a practice of deep, deep gratitude. And in our understanding of that, we bring forth not just praise of God, not just worship of God, but then we also graft in the story of God and the story of God's people. That is much like we're thinking about blood memory, across time and space. Right? At the altar, when we're giving this level of thanksgiving, we believe that we are connecting with heaven and earth. And at the same altar table that we are gathered around, our ancestors are gathered around, and in some ways the future people are gathered around. And as we say in the prayer, we join with angels and archangels when we sing. That's not just a nice little bit of cosmology, as if there could be little cosmology. We mean that in that kind of cosmic string theory way, where when you like pluck an A string on the violin, the E string vibrates in time. Same thing when humans sing together. Their hearts start to beat at the same time. Their brain waves start to go at the same time. So if we're singing with the angels in heaven, our brain waves are going with the angels in heaven. Our hearts are beating in time with heaven. And so it's that level of thanksgiving and mindfulness that we're bringing into our rituals and our stories. So if we want to heal not just as individuals, but if we want to heal as culture, we need to then make sure that our rituals of gratitude are first and foremost, and that we don't lose them. And I think that's one of the reasons when I see the numbers of people who are coming to church decrease, what makes me sad about that is we're losing a chance where we can do intergenerational gratitude mindfulness. And so like for me, the rituals are a big piece of that. And of course, then storytelling, right? We are a culture that doesn't do this as much as we used to do. Joseph Campbell, the great collector of human stories, and the person who really put a lot of names to the language of storytelling. Joseph Campbell talks about the way we don't make myths anymore and how scary that is. That you can see kind of the decline of human society with the decline of people sitting around fires and telling stories about the cosmos. It makes sense with the way the brain works, right? If we're hardwired to make stories and we make our stories of meaning and gratitude together in community, how much more will we be healed, right? You know, and how much more do we need that? Yes, Carolyn, I see your hand.
I just wanted to, this sort of fits in with Sue Tate's question about, I think it was Sue, was somebody talking about, can gratitude go forward? And my mother was an incredibly positive person in difficult situations, and how grateful I am for that. And I think because of that, I've noticed things like that. And I've always sort of pushed that in our liturgy, if you're doing liturgy with children and you have a communal Thanksgiving, they can go on forever. They have a hard time thinking of the, you know, somebody maybe is sick, my grandparent or something, but whereas with adults, we can come up with a huge laundry list of all the problems in the world that God needs to do something about. But then you say Thanksgivings and you don't hear anything.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if some of that is that people will feel like they're bragging or they're, you know, tooting their own horn, or I'm saying something nice and somebody else will feel bad because they don't have that. We have all these excuses, but I mean, all I know is even if we're giving thanks silently, I won't name names, but I don't begin to get the time in my service in my church when we get to the Thanksgivings. I'm only halfway through my list and it's on to the rest of the prayer.
I actually think you're onto something, and I think there's a reason why we need intergenerational praying there, right?
Yeah.
First and foremost, because good liturgy, and you know, sorry, I'll put my liturgist hat on for a moment. Good liturgy has room for the shadow side. It must name it. In fact, it must name the laments of life. And the absolute gratitudes of life. You need both for it to be real liturgy. Otherwise, it's just celebration, but in the cheap version of celebration, right? Like just 4th of July. We're not going to say anything bad about America on the 4th of July. We're just going to put up some fireworks, right? You know, like it, and yet we need both in equal measure. So when children are sent away during church services, they may never get to see an adult cry in church. They may never get to see an adult like lament in church. So they might not know the depth of being held in community while you're despondent. And likewise, if children aren't in the same place where adults are worshiping, we may only have our laments. We may not have as much joy as we might need. So truly, the intergenerational piece of this goes beyond just the biology into the way we are healed by future generations too. Yeah, thank you, Catherine.
Hi, I'm wondering that I'm changing the subject a bit. I'm going back to your gratitude list where you said you wrote things down. I'm wondering how important you think the writing process is in this, and if that's something that you encourage, or do you think there's other ways to record?
I'm so glad you asked this question. Thank you. For me, I think the physical act of writing is important because it's embodied. So I'm going to say that with a big caveat, right? So one of the things we know about trauma incorporation is that the body plays a really critical role, because if the body is the one, as the title of van der Kolk's really great book says, if the body is what's keeping the score, the body also needs to be used in healing it, right? And we know it's keeping the score. We just named all the ways the body still holds on to trauma. So when you are looking to do a mindfulness activity, some of the ones that are so important are the ones that you can use the body, even if it's just getting hand on paper, because it's a hand to brain connection to help rewire some neurological pathways. But this is why breathing techniques are often such a great mindfulness tool. Yoga, I'm a yoga teacher. I can't tell you how much it's changed my life. You know, just being able to physically sit with this stuff in my body and then find a new place to kind of resurrect it out, so it's not just living in my body. So that's why I would say yes to the actual physical writing, because it's a physical process. So anything you do, even taking a walk in nature, as we've seen listed in our chat, it's so important to get moving as much as you possibly can, to find, and if moving is not, if that's not available to you, even taking the breathing practices and adding it into mindfulness. Thank you. Great question. Anybody else? We're going to go into small groups in a moment, but I'd love to know if there are any other
Hi.
thoughts or questions. Yeah, I think.
Elizabeth is my name.
Thanks, Elizabeth. There you are. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for this. This is so helpful, so timely, so beautiful. Everything about the body. You probably know that there's an epidemic in suicide among teenagers and young adults. And I'm a therapist, and I would love to hear your thoughts about grief for a grandmother, a parent, dealing with that level of trauma that seems unimaginable grief.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And you've named what's so true right now. What we do with grief is very similar to, I think, what we do with trauma in the body, because it's a heartbreak. And what we said earlier, of course, is that the brain doesn't know the difference. It's that same level of pain. So it truly is a trauma to lose somebody who's such a part of you, and to watch it happening on such a societal level. I would say that with grief in particular, we used to do better at helping people grieve in community, right? We used to actually, one of the beautiful modalities of grief training that I've received is called Walking the Mourner's Path. And some of you may have that in your particular parish. But it comes from the tradition of where there used to be a path outside of most churches, where when somebody was in grief, needed a companion, they would walk the path, and somebody would just go and walk with them. Not to explain it away, not to do all the stuff we try to do about, oh, you'll feel better later. No, just to walk. We also used to do things like just wearing black armbands, or just wearing black in general, right? So that people knew you were in a different moment in life. But now, I'll tell you what, after about 3 weeks, people don't come calling anymore. You know, like their lives have moved in a different, faster direction. So again, I think this goes back to the community piece. We desperately need community more now than ever, and people in particular, the young people in our lives. What we also know is those who are in community tend to have lower suicide rates. Intergenerational communities, I will say, because they know that there are adults in their lives who see worth in them, even if it's not just their parents or grandpa, etc. Right? You know, so it is again, I know what would you expect a priest to say? But hey, church is good. but it's becoming more important to say it, because there's less and less of it going on. And I would just say, though, Elizabeth, thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry for that grief, and sit there with you, because we need more community around our young people and around those who are grieving.
Well, and there's so much about the fact that nobody saw this coming, and we hear this all the time. They didn't talk about it, they didn't share it, and the particular person I'm thinking of had wonderful family around them, but I'm not sure they had what you're talking about, church community, or even and damn COVID, the isolation. This girl was alone in her dorm room, and I've heard several stories about that just this week. And I think it's just, as you're saying, we need each other, and we need to articulate that and reach out to all generations.
We were in a loneliness crisis of epic proportions even before the pandemic, and we haven't even been able to study what that looks like beyond the pandemic. And the idea of not having our society address that and the huge mental health issues that go alongside of it is staggering. It's terrifying, and the idea that problems are getting more complex and people have never been more isolated is a double fracture. On top of all of that, when we get into these modes, we tend to be more and more siloed, because if our brain wants to make connection, we try to make connection of, I'm like this person, I'm not like that person, so now I feel more included. And so it's like this perpetual thing in society that keeps getting worse and worse. So I'll stop there because I think I saw Christopher's hand, and then Connie, it looks like Randall wants to say something, so sure, that's of course.
No, I was just wanted to make you aware of the note from Connie about Randall.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well then, Randall, please join us.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I appreciate what you're doing. And I been dealing with quite a bit of trauma over time. And one of the things that you have said, and counselors, doctors, and others have said to me, is the importance of exercise. And unfortunately, I have physical problems that prevent a lot right at this point, but they're getting better. But in looking at gratitude, I particularly over the last 2 years feel tremendous gratitude for the people around me, for my wife, for the medical people who have taken care of me, for the community we live in, colleagues, and so on. And but what you're talking about goes beyond that, which is something that I really want to think about. But something you've mentioned a couple times that I find particularly useful and immediately useful is joy. And you mentioned listening to the birds sing, and I find that I get some immediate relief from anxiety by listening to music.
Yeah.
And my tastes are very eclectic, so I mean it's all over the place. But and it has bump-on effects because not only do I feel better, I tend to be able to do more work, and I also tend to sleep better afterwards as well. So it lasts long enough so that I at least get a good night's sleep. Thank you.
I love it. And thank you for that. And oh my gosh, music's such a great one. And of course, it goes back to the physicality of it too, right? It's the audible thing that is wonderful, but then it also as we said, if we add a little bit of singing with it, oh, our heart rates start to change. And when we listen to it, our brain waves start to go. So we're actually, there's a lot of studies about chanting or listening to music and watching how it just kind of syncs the brain. So it's both a beautiful auditory way to center down and a physical way. So I love that. Thank you, Randall. I feel the same. All right, friends, we're going to take a little time to have some group discussion around this as well. And so here's your prompt. You're gonna have time together in small group. We'll be together for till about 11:15. Or is that right? I'm forgetting. Let's see.
We conclude at 11:15 your time.
Oh, right. Okay, that's where.
So we probably want 10 minutes, maybe. Or
thank you. 10 minutes is what I meant. Thank you. And you're gonna share with one another something that you have deep gratitude for. In particular, an ancestor. If you have a story about an ancestor who you have deep gratitude for, I'd love for you to share that with one another. And if you don't have an ancestor in particular that comes to mind, maybe you can think of something that has happened in your life in particular that is an ancestor of circumstance rather than by actual blood, let's say, a saint in your life that you would be able to share a grateful story with. All right, sound good? All right, we're going to take 10 minutes for that. You'll be in small groups, and we'll call you all back at that time. All right, looks like we're almost all back. I think we're all back. Does that look right to you, Jennifer? Pretty much.
yes, it does. It does. I think we've got everybody back.
We've all been raptured back here. Welcome back. Well, we don't have too much longer together for tonight, but the very nice thing about this first part of our time together with Theologian in Residency is that we'll have a part 2 of this in the not too distant future. And so there's a little bit of homework to do in between, and I do hope you'll consider this a challenge you're up to doing, because it will inform our conversation next time. So please. But it very much incorporates this particular sort of work. So your homework requires a little explanation. We're going to be doing a very beautiful exercise called a spiritual genogram. Now, some of you may know a genogram and how to use that already in your life, but for those who don't, let me explain it. It's like a family tree, but 3.0. It's designed to have you give you a tool for self-awareness, personal development, let's say, and relational development. And we also then take the genogram and then make it spiritual. So a genogram, you'll start by putting all of the people in your life who are family or who have been like family to you. So in particular, let's say you have mom, dad, grandparents. Try to go for about 3 generations. You don't need to do 7 unless you happen to already be somebody who does genealogical work in your own life and you have a family tree like that. If not, 3 generations will do. Like your grandparents, your mom and dad, you and your offspring, that's 4 generations, but something like that. And what is different about a genogram than a normal family tree, and don't worry, we'll send you a PDF with these symbols in it. You make it so that the symbolic relationship between people is also listed. So for example, you wouldn't just put somebody who's married or separated. You could also put if their relationship was really bonded, or if they perhaps had some codependency, or if they had a traumatic relationship or a strained relationship, right? You can put that sort of thing on the genogram. There's also ways to denote things like sexual abuse, those who struggled with addiction. There's ways of putting on there any sort of secret that might have been kept. Talk about family stuff, right? The secrets that were kept. You may even to this day not know all the secrets that are kept in your family, but you may have known there was a secret, right? So you can list that down. Also, any other sorts of major traumas, an injury that impacted a person's life, physical or mental illness, you might include the details for that. And again, all of these things have symbols that we'll give to you that makes it easy to put in one, like an infograph of your family. That's a genogram in general, but what we're going to do then is add a spiritual layer. I'd like you to also add to your genogram those things that are your spiritual and cultural lineage. What is in your background? Was your grandmother a devout Baptist and it shaped every decision she made? Was your grandpa an Anglican priest? Like whatever you might put on there, or were they not religious at all? However you might put. Do they also have a spirituality about them that goes beyond naming it religiously? Were they a particularly joyful person, and why? Did you see them practice gratitude, and why? You can also put on this, in the spiritual part of this, anybody who's part of your spiritual background that isn't family. This could include an author. It could include a priest in your life. It could include a yoga teacher, or somebody who is a saint, right? That has had a huge part of your faith development. List all of that, because what you're going to be able to do with this in our conversations next time is start to see what lives in your blood memory, right? What have you inherited, both the traumas and the virtues and the graces, the rituals and the stories? What do you carry with you, so that when we start to practice things that go beyond our trauma, we can start to lean into what we already have in our blood memory. That's like the stuff we want to lean into, right? The gratitude practices that are already there because our ancestors are with us as well. This will likely be an emotional exercise. Give yourself a nice bit of time to do it, because it's hard enough just trying to make a family tree, right? Getting the dates and stuff all in there, but then you add the family stuff. That's a totally different thing altogether. Yes, and we're also going, oh, thank you. Sorry about my paper hitting the mic there, pardon me. And want to also be able to then, when we come back together next time, start to brainstorm how we might put this more into our life, right? Like how this might be something we want to bring into maybe even a rule of life, as it were, to use that classic phrase from antiquity. Any questions about this, or anybody have any background in the genogram they might want to share with us? Kathy, were you adding something? It's
Oh, I have a question, but it's not specifically about genogram.
That's okay.
You know, you've spoken about a blood memory reaching 7 generations back and 7 generations into the future. I'm interested specifically in how your native heritage, how do you look at people who have had no children?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How does that reach? How does that work?
Great. So in particular, in the native view of this, you're influencing 7 generations, whether or not you've had children, right? So this is where their great love of ecology really comes into play, right? So the choices we make every day influence what will happen 7 generations from now, including how much plastic we use, including if the wars that we might be fighting, including even something as small we might think of as small, but as like the things we leave behind when we are gone. You know, like there's this, especially right now in human history, it's never been easier to see how long our human impact on the planet is going to last, right? So when you think generationally, yes, you can think of the blood memory as an actual blood, but then you can also think about like the communal memory and how we are changing the world for the good or perhaps not. So yeah, thank you. It's an important question because some of us, we may not even know our blood memory either. So how do we do? That's why it's also the spiritual lineage too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Well, one thing I would say from having done genograms for years is have fun with them. Like you can think of them almost like cartoons. Like if your mother was a narcissist, you could put a crown on her head, you know, and use your imagination and your creativity. And there's a symbol for alcoholism that's a circle with a slash through it. But, you know, I used to just put little champagne glasses around here and there. So it doesn't have to be so tedious. You can enjoy it. And I'm wondering, like, when you talk about do you remember the paper we used to put over something that was thin? What was it called?
Like tracing paper?
Tracing paper, yes. I mean, how do we put the spiritual on top of all this, you know, crazy family stuff? How do we get that in there?
That's a great question, like a great process question. And I also love the invitation to keep it light, because this, as I said, this could be painful. And how do you feel safe doing it? Well, keeping it light's one way, but also the same thing we said in the beginning of this class. If this feels like it might be traumatic, then it might be something you might want to do with a therapist or a trusted friend. It might be something that you choose not to do, and that's okay too, right? You know, like, or you take it in small chunks. The first time I did it, it was really helpful for me to do it over several days rather just in one sitting. Because once you start to see some patterns emerge that you're like, oh, oh, and things start falling into place, you're going to need some time to maybe sit with it. And again, you don't need to do this in a vacuum either. You know, reach out to a trusted friend as you're doing it to let them know what you're going through. But yes, the process piece of how do you lay it over? My favorite way to do this is with lots of different colors. Like get yourself your fun colored pencils or your markers, because art is so good for the brain when you're working on any sort of trauma. So make it fun. Maybe one color is for this spiritual lineage, one color is for that prayer group, one color is for this saint. And then, make it as visual as possible. And I like your use of different symbols too, right? So maybe instead of a circle for a person, if it's a spiritual gift that they brought, you might put a dove. Or if they were really grateful, you might put a heart there on their symbol, right? So let yourself get a little creative and use a lot of colors. That's probably the best and easiest tip. Yeah, thanks. Any other thoughts or questions? Just looking at the different windows, see if I see any hands. I don't want to miss anybody.
How much time are you thinking it'll be for the next session? I don't remember seeing that there were following sessions.
Do you mean what is the date, or how much time will it be?
Yeah, either way.
Okay. Absolutely. So Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have it as March 16th at the same time spot. Is that right?
That's right.
Today?
A week from today, March 16th, from 6:45 p.m. to 8:15, the link that you have will bring you back to the group.
Okay. How fabulous.
Oh,
And
good.
then I should also say that Hillary will be joining us several other times this year, both virtually in May and then in person later on in the second half of the year. So I think that this work will continue to unfold under her guidance.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad that came as good news to you, Anne. Phew. But there's, and just to give you a note about what are some of our other topics, one of our themes will be spiritual contemplative practices as a balm for the soul. So if you are a prayer, come on down. If you have not yet started a contemplative practice, come on down. It's going to have something for everybody. We're also going to, at a certain point in the year, talk about Mary Magdalene and wisdom practices. It's part of my current research, so I'm really looking forward to that. And then our final time together will be intersectionality and liminality, really looking at, and liturgy, and really looking at how the parts of who we are can be brought together in liturgy with a lot of integrity. But we're going to also talk about that fine line between appreciation and appropriation, right, in our liturgies, right? So it'll be, I think, a very rich conversation. So that's your little preview.
And you'll be with us in person later this year, preaching as well.
Yes, that's one of those times, as a matter of fact. So I'm looking forward to it.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. So I'd love to wrap us up in prayer, if that would work for you all. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God of our ancestors, God of spirit, God of wisdom and light and joy, we ask that you hold us in the palm of your hand during these times. Let us move through this time with healing, with integrity, with grace. We ask that you make us mindful of the needs of others, especially those suffering from COVID, suffering in Ukraine, suffering all over the world, at our borders and in our homes. Help us, Lord, to be so fashioned after you that we bear our marks of trauma the same way Jesus bears his marks of resurrection, that they may be pathways to life and to wholeness. All this we ask in the name of one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Hillary, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. And thank you to all of you who joined. I'll be sending out an email in the next day or so with the materials that she mentioned. And we do begin at 6:45 next week. And if any of this stirs up things you'd like to talk about, please reach out to me. I don't think I introduced myself at the beginning. I'm Canon Jennifer Doherty, one of the priests at St. Mark's, and Our deacon Lindsay Stolaker is here, and our other priests, Eliasine Rosario Cruz and Dean Steve Thomason, are also part of this. So we are here for you as you think about your spiritual genograms. Thank you.
It was an absolute treat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary.
Or do you want to stay on for a second so I make sure I have gotten everything I need to get to you?
Yes, ma'am.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for coming.
Good group.
Mm.